Hello everyone, welcome to Creativity in Technology webinar series. I am Noya. This is our fifth talk and I am very excited to have Dr. Priti Parikh as our speaker today. Hello, Dr. Parikh.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, I think we can hear you.
Brilliant.
So if anyone is experiencing technical issue, you can just pop up your question in Q&A box. Dr. Parikh set up a master program in UCL. She is a professor in our university, and the master program is called Engineering for International Development with the view of equipping engineering with the skill sets required to address global challenges and provide appropriate infrastructure solutions in resource-challenged settings in areas such as South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And she also set up and now leads the Engineering for International Development Research Center. So I think Dr. Parikh, you must have many experience and work to talk about the creative engineering and creative problem solving in your projects in resource challenged areas, and also about the interdisciplinary knowledge engagement. So I can't wait to hear your presentation. Are you ready for now?
Thank you, yes. And thank you for inviting me to this very exciting series of talks. I think it's kind of time we talk about creativity in technology, because quite often engineering is seen to be a very dull and dry profession, but actually engineering is a profession where you can shape and create human settlements and cities. So for me, it's very exciting to be an engineer. And I thought it would be quite interesting to take you through my journey. I grew up in India, which is a country of contradictions. So on one hand, you have the best engineering institutions in the world, leading world scientists working on first-class research, whether it's related to space or medical and life sciences. But then on the other hand, in that country, you have about 30 or 40% of the population. This is a billion people who live in very poor conditions in terms of the environment, in terms of access to basic services, such as water, sanitation, and housing conditions. And it makes you kind of wonder what the purpose of engineering is, as people know how to design houses, people know how to design toilets and taps, but I feel that sometimes what is lacking is the creativity around application of those solutions in challenging and complex settings. And it was really this kind of school of thinking which got me interested in engineering. And having grown up in India, I used to visit slums a lot. So slums are settings which are extremely dense, very high density settings, with overcrowding, with houses very close to each other, and predominantly people do not have infrastructure in their houses. So they would go to common points to collect water or sanitation and other services. So very poor living conditions with multiple and complex challenges. And for me, engineering in this setting is very exciting because it's thinking about what type of solutions are really appropriate for the setting. So just to take a simple example of building a road, traditional details and traditional construction processes will simply not work because you cannot fit in the larger vehicles which are required for road surfacing. So then what type of roads can you create? Or if you think about drainage and underground infrastructure, you cannot excavate very deep because the pathways are so narrow. So there is an extremely high level of creativity required when working in such resource challenge settings. And if you do not engage and show a lack of creativity, if you do not engage and show creativity, this is what you have. So this is a public toilet, and the intent or purpose behind this project was to provide safe, secure, and clean facilities to 100 houses living in that settlement. But as you can see, all it has ended up being is a useless concrete box in the middle of nowhere. And in fact, I would argue that it leads to further infections and hence is more harmful to the community. And this is an example of lack of creativity in engineering, where a standard public toilet solution has just been copied and pasted without a consideration of the local topography or terrain, consideration of the context and of the needs required. So creativity is extremely important and is required for addressing some of those global challenges. And to that end, I set up at UCL master's programs, but in addition to that, more recently, I have created this interdisciplinary research center called EFID, Engineering for International Development, which is bringing together expertise from different disciplines to jointly tackle global challenges. And the reason for that is, and I think COVID-19 highlights that very clearly, that some of the challenges we face are extremely complex and will require people from the disciplines of health and psychology, environment, engineering to all work together. Because without that interdisciplinary knowledge creation, we'll not be able to tackle those challenges effectively. And quite a lot of our design thinking is also around making sure that the infrastructure we create and design is inclusive, especially with consideration for women who quite often bear the burden of poor infrastructure. So this team members from my research center who all do amazing work. And what I wanted to do is sort of showcase fairly quickly a few research projects, not all of them, but key research projects where I feel we are pushing boundaries either in terms of the collaboration, product, or process. So one thing that I've realized being an associate professor at UCL for the last some years is that I have somehow ended up working more with non-engineers than engineers. But I feel that this is vital in terms of taking engineering into other disciplines and vice versa. And to this end, I'm working on a project in India, which is a unique collaboration between experts in health, education, environment, and we are jointly tackling the problem of child health. And the region where we are working in India, over 50% of children are malnourished and stunted. And even though they grow food there, there's good agricultural productivity, they have access to watering paths, somehow this problem persists. So as an interdisciplinary team, we started from scratch by co-designing tools and co-designing interventions, bringing together knowledge from our disciplines. So that meant that we started to take into account not only just interventions on nutrition, but we brought in factors such as water, sanitation, energy, improvements that were required, but we also thereby started thinking about how schools could be used to deliver some of those interventions. Similarly, I've been also engaged in a project in South Africa where when I say we, it's architects, planners. So this is more an interdisciplinary project within the built environment where we've been engaging with a community over the last 3 years. And we've been using a combination of very interesting tools. For example, we've combined drone mapping with community engagement tools, with semi-structured interviews, with transit books. And by combining those tools, we've not only collected valuable data on the day-to-day experiences or lived experiences of those communities, but what we've also done is we've also been able to mobilize the community to campaign for better infrastructure. And as a result of our efforts, after 3 years, the municipality there has agreed to improve infrastructure. So we feel that the design and the findings were not the biggest outcome out of this project. It was more the advocacy piece where now the residents will have access to improved services. And this was due to that creative partnership and the collection of creative tools that we used in our approach. I'm currently on a 5-year fellowship with Royal Academy of Engineering, and this is about looking at energy solutions. And this project is very exciting because I'm working with households who have never used electricity in their lives before. So the big challenge, the big question now is for those households who are using solar home systems, which are solar systems within their houses, how are they going to use energy in the future? What type of appliances do they need? What type of industry standards do we need to be created? And we don't quite have the answer to those type of questions. And that's what really creative engineering is about. It's about kind of exploring technical solutions in settings which are novel, which are new, but where conventional, traditional approaches do not necessarily apply. And to give you an example, there are multiple models on how to predict energy consumption trends, but most of them are based on very traditional centralized grid systems, but not for a collection of, say, 100 houses in a community in, say, Kenya or Rwanda. So this is where my fellowship in the next 4 years will push boundaries, thinking about how trying to predict how people who've never used electricity in their lives before will interact with electricity. What would they want to do with it? And how can that then inform practitioners and policymakers in the future? And this project is very exciting. This is the first time I'm engaging more closely with the discipline of psychology. So I'm working with colleagues from psychology, earthquake engineering, and I lead the work on environment. And in this, we are thinking about a holistic kind of recovery process from multiple hazards and disasters. So we are engaged with local partners in Indonesia, and we are working, they're using schools as a hub to look at how to build resilience in communities who've been affected by a combination of tsunamis, earthquakes, and now we need to add COVID to the picture as well. But it's thinking through that process of recovery, which is about building resilience for future disasters, and also how communities respond in the immediate future to those disasters. And also thinking about how to make those processes more inclusive. So for example, within our project, we've included schools as a delivery hub once again, but within that, I'm focusing on access to water sanitation, because the best way to attract female students to schools, for example, is ensuring that they have safe and secure water sanitation facilities. So it's thinking more holistically about gender inclusive processes to build resilience. And my belief is that creative engineering should be about solutions, creating solutions which are sustainable, so solutions which are long lasting. It requires an interdisciplinary approach. There should be some form of multiplier. So for example, if you invest in infrastructure, it should lead to improvement in housing, generation of business. So there should be some form of multiplier effect. The solutions should be simple, because it's actually very difficult to design simple solutions. Simplicity is very hard to achieve, but very productive and effective when implemented. It should be appropriate for the local context. It should be about improving human lives. So the societal piece, I think, increasingly is becoming important. And in a way, COVID-19 has highlighted how inequitable the distribution of resources is currently in our society. It is about frugality, especially because I work in settings where resources are limited. So for me to create designs which are not efficient, for example, energy efficient, which are not efficient in terms of use of material, would not be appropriate. And often engineering is seen as a product. So people see engineering as about building a bridge or building a house or building a toilet. But actually there's far more investment which needs to go into the process, the journey of delivering infrastructure and housing. And I think therefore there needs to be innovation both in process and product. And if all those characteristics are achieved, then it is quite likely that engineering will lead to self-reliance and will lead to appropriate localized solutions within the countries, within the local communities. So I'm going to end here, because I know that there'll possibly be, we need to keep time for discussion and questions. If you need to contact me, my details are available here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parikh. I found those projects are very, very interesting. You are like really experienced in this, like engineering in resource limits and context. So actually, so for our audience, live audience, if you have any question, you can leave your question in Q&A box, and I will pick some questions and ask Dr. Parikh. And I do have some questions here, so maybe I will start. So as you've just described, if you work in resource limits context alone. So I'm just wondering, what are the differences actually between the engineering in extreme resource limit context and the engineering in moderate resource limit context? So what are the main differences? And what's the role of creativity? Like maybe the creativity plays different roles in different contexts. What do you think about it?
I would argue and say that in resource challenge settings, there needs to be more creativity. It's harder to apply solutions to those settings. And I was alluding to examples earlier where if you look at traditional design standards, so if you look at standards and guidelines and best practices for infrastructure of roads, they're very much geared towards the mainstream city, which would have wider footpaths, which would have wider areas. You can bring in more specialist equipment to implement your solutions. Versus in quite a lot of settings, whether it's informal settlements, whether it's refugee camps, most of the access ways are quite narrow. So in a way, it means you have to consider a lot of solutions where you can use more manual labor techniques rather than mechanization. So to give you a more concrete example, in quite a lot of slums, instead of using the traditional road surfacing and materials, we look at concrete roads, because then you can construct concrete slabs in smaller sizes, and you can engage more with manual labor. So it's really thinking about challenging the standards to see how they apply in those settings. But I would argue that more creativity is therefore required, and it requires often an understanding which needs engineers to go back to first principles.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, we may need more creativity in extreme resource limit context. But I'm wondering whether the extreme resource limit itself would increase people's creativity and increase their level of creative thinking. Do you think these effects work?
Oh, I mean, people who live in these communities are super smart. I mean, they have to be to survive in the very difficult settings they do. I mean, if I was living in an informal settlement, I'm not sure how many days I would survive there. The conditions can be very challenging, very harsh. I mean, imagine if I had to wake up every day and I had to spend an hour collecting water, another hour collecting fuel for cooking, and then I would have to spend another hour cleaning, and then in the midst of that, clean up the house, send children to school, find time to earn my livelihood. So it's a very difficult setting, and I'm always taken aback by how smart people are, how resourceful people are, and also how positive people are in the midst of those harsh conditions and challenges. And in India, we worked on a couple of slum projects where we provided infrastructure and people started upgrading their houses. And we realized that people were grading houses with such beautiful and creative designs, whether it's colors, whether it's facades, and they would use secondhand materials from construction sites, and they would upgrade their houses at 1/10 of the cost of what the government would do if it was a government-driven traditional scheme, where they would go through traditional contracting processes. So absolutely, the people who live in resource challenge settings are far more smarter than we are.
Oh, yes, that's I think it's quite interesting, and I think that's some assumption I've always made. I think the resource limit would increase people's creativity, and creativity will benefit engineering in resource limit context. And you just your experience just approved that kind of assumption. We may need further exploration in psychology research, but I think this is a quite supportive evidence there just from your experience. And also I would like to ask what are the resource limits, the very impressive resource limit in your previous cases, in your projects? So do you have any example for that, one of them?
One of the big ones which people often forget is ownership of land and title deeds. So quite a lot of people who may be living in refugee camps and informal settlements and do not own the properties, technically own the properties, or do not have land rights that they live on, which means that if they want to go to high street banks and conventional places to get loans, it's very challenging. And that also limits their ability to invest in improving their living conditions. So lack of ownership and title deed is neglected, but it's a big barrier. The challenges, the lack of resources could be financial, but often it could be environmental. So the lack of ability to access water sanitation in your houses, so not having toilets and taps in your houses, is a big resource challenge, for example. Limited access to livelihood or limited access to schools, health clinics, health facilities. So there are all sorts of kind of constraints and resource limitations that those residents suffer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think when you said you have budget limits and the like limits access to the school and everything. I have talked to some engineering students from, you know, they're not doing research in extreme resource limit context, and when I ask them how do you like deal with those problems with the limit budget and not limit budget, maybe limit resource, limit access to some resource. And they will always tell me that, okay, I will apply for more grant. I will just pay for that. I will just use more money. But I'm just wondering if there is difference between like, so how do you solve your like problem in extreme resource limit condition? Do you have a different perspective of view to those problems? Do you also think about more money, or do you have different way to solve problems?
That's a good question, and it comes back to the point I was making about multiplier effect, which perhaps I could unpack a little bit more now. So what I meant by multiplier effect is quite often you could think of the appropriate intervention to snowball a range of events. So for example, in India, if the government was to provide infrastructure and housing to everyone homeless, they simply do not have the money to do so. But if the government said, okay, we're going to give you some form of clarity on land ownership and give you limited infrastructure in your house, but you build the houses by yourself, then the government of India has the budget to do so. Thinking about the multiplier effect, but it's also thinking about partnership. So for example, building the infrastructure, what type of partnerships we needed to co-invest or co-fund the cost? So it could be that the communities could contribute a tiny amount, but then you could have local governments and you could have donors and funders contribute. So you kind of look at a 3- or 4-way partnership, and in that way you divide the cost between multiple partners and then make the project more feasible. But it's really about the multiplier effect. So thinking about how your project will generate future investments from multiple other sources, or it could generate investment for people investing themselves through labor as well. Because if people are self-constructing houses, then they are investing through labor, through acquisition of materials.
Yeah, well, I think your answer is always like very in practice. Like when you talk about the collaboration, it's not just you need to collaborate with other stakeholders. It's like you have very specific like chain there. It's like to collaborate with government, and also we need to make our maybe solution more sustainable to convince them like to have more future investment, to get more future investment like for the projects. Thank you. And also I think we have another like question is about, I received this is from interdisciplinary knowledge. And because I know that you're like you're a founder of the interdisciplinary
yes.
research center and also the MSc program, right? So how much do you think that interdisciplinary knowledge would benefit the creative thinking and the production, like the innovation? So how much do you think it works in that?
In a way, COVID-19 exactly highlights why interdisciplinary thinking is required, because for the first time, the way we engage and interact with our cities is dictated by a pandemic. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime, as I'm sure others would have not have joined this session. And it's really got kind of built environment professionals thinking about now how to design cities which can be pandemic proof, if there's such a thing, and more resilient. But then in order to achieve that, we will have to engage with experts from health, for example. We also need to engage with experts from behavioral sciences, otherwise how will we understand if those solutions are acceptable to people or not? So if you're making recommendations on public transport changes, we need to understand the behavioral aspect. So there's a very clear case in light of COVID on why interdisciplinary working is so crucial.
Thank you. So I think we have another, it's not just the interdisciplinary knowledge. We have a question is that how much do you think the creativity is linked to the, I think this means the knowledge we have in a specific field. How much do you think is?
So hi Judith, I actually know Judith. So Judith, thank you so much for joining us today. I believe she's joining us from South Africa. So I think I get the sense of where her question is coming from, because rightly so, there's a lot of kind of knowledge and skills which are created and passed over from generations. And if I give an example of South Africa and the project there, I was quite, and this is a big difference between the settlements in India and South Africa. I was quite struck when I visited the settlements that a lot of people were practicing urban farming. And I went to houses where outside the houses, in a very tiny patch, you could see vegetables being grown beautifully and technically in a sound way. So things would be planted at the right distance, the watering would be done at the right time. So it's very clear that the household had a very good understanding of those farming practices. And when we discussed this further with the communities, it's actually elder women who traditionally were occupied or had a knowledge of farming activities, who came from rural parts, decided to apply their knowledge to an urban setting. So I agree that there's definitely a lot we can learn from some of those traditional indigenous practices.
And I think we have another question. Like, I think this one, maybe I'll just pop it up. Like, do you think in your lab or in your center, is there any opportunity for postdoc studies?
I'm in a mission to grow my research center, and I'm constantly now applying for grants and funds. And I hope that if some of them materialize, there should be opportunities. And it would be a pleasure to engage with everyone.
Yeah. So for those people who may be interested in like doing research with you, maybe in the future, do you have any, not even with you, but generally for engineering students who need to increase their creativity or increase their engagement in interdisciplinary knowledge, do you have any suggestion for them, for like either like the undergraduate students, master or PhD students? So
I'm going to start with a word of warning that it's harder to do interdisciplinary work. Because it's harder to, because it takes more time investment to find a common language between disciplines. It's harder to publish because once you bring different disciplines together, there are extensive discussions around where you could publish this knowledge and who would be the audience. So it's harder and it takes slightly longer. But I would say then the impact of that is far-reaching and it's far more rewarding, because what it brings to life is the question on engineering of so what. So if you're running an experiment, for example, so what? So what is the impact of that? So it responds directly to the question of so what, I think. So while it's a longer journey, it's a worthwhile journey.
Thank you very much. So the practical implication is, you think, is something would make our work more impactful and more. Yeah. Thank you. I think it's like, it's not even just benefit, like your suggestion, not just benefit like engineering people, also for our psychology people or for us who want to do the interdisciplinary research in the future. It's very, very like useful, the suggestion. Thank you very much.
I think it's going to be, definitely it's going to be the future. I can see reasons why, and I can see, especially in UCL, I know that there is much stronger engagement and understanding around why interdisciplinary working is so important. I mean, I almost feel that UCL is leading kind of the pathway for interdisciplinary working.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Parikh. Thank you for your talk and your answers. I think I learned a lot. To be honest, I'm very interested in resource limit context, the creativity in resource limit context. I think it's very, very inspiring. I'll definitely get in touch with her. Thank you very much.
No, thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules and joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, audience. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.